The condemnation for Sudan's coup has come in swift and hard since Monday. The military's action puts all the work for the past 2 years at risk. And what work is that? Long-standing ruler Omar al-Bashir was removed from office after 3 decades in power. Weeks of protests eventually led to the military and civilian leaders setting up a transitional government known as the Sovereign Council. Now, Sudan's economy has been in a deep crisis with high inflation and shortages of food, fuel, and medicine. The coup comes amid acute tension between the military and civilian factions of the Sovereign Council, with each blaming the other for the failure to resolve the cost of living crisis that has been ongoing since the start of the year. That crisis has been exacerbated by an effective blockade at Port Sudan by tribal protesters from the northeast. Among other demands, these demonstrators object to the cancellation of the Juba peace agreement signed between the government and rebel groups in October 2020, which they argue does not represent their interest. The blockade has put a strain on the government supplies of essential medicines, fuel, and wheat, plunging the country's economic and humanitarian situation deeper into the mire. The promised reform that 2 years after the transition has held, both domestically and in terms of international relations and stability, hangs in the balance in light of Monday's coup. Today, we'll be looking at the economic implications of Sudan's coup. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. Welcome. This is Business Edge. Now joining me from Nairobi, Kenya is Aly Khan Satchu, Africa Geoeconomic and Macro Analyst. He's also the CEO of Rich Management. Aly Khan, welcome back to Business Edge again. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with this. We know that for the past 2 years now, there's been a very fragile power sharing agreement that's been in place in Sudan between the military and civilian leaders. And in those 2 years, the economy has struggled to move away from the legacy of the Omar al-Bashir years as well. And there's been some progress, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But what was the stance? Where was Sudan's economy right before Monday in terms of how things were either opening up, where the people were in terms of the inflation and the shortages? Where was Sudan's economy before the announcement of the coup on Monday?
So, Sudan, if you take the longest sweep, had been under tremendous pressure. It had just emerged from the previous sanctions regime that had been in place for decades. There were still teething problems. We had a surge in the inflation rate, which was making the cost of living very expensive for the average citizen. We had a huge debt relief program, which had been put into place by the transitional government, which was easing the debt load that had been there for quite a number of years. But really, it had been quite a tricky situation on the ground, but relief was coming. I think the relief came too slowly from the multilateral institutions and international countries. So it remained under significant pressure, negative GDP growth, it's plenty of pressure points, unfortunately.
Okay, so let's talk about where things stand. And then there has been a lot of finger pointing and blame going on between the military and the civilian leaders who sit on this council. So ousted Prime Minister Abdallah Hamdok has become increasingly outspoken in his criticism of the military's engagement and entanglements with the economy. The army commands a vast share of the national budget. Military-owned companies are said to operate with tax exemptions and often allegedly have corrupt contracting procedures. Now, the military has said that the coup was needed to avert a civil war, and pro-military protesters have accused the government of failing to revive the country's economic fortunes. Now, you mentioned that the progress was being made, international lending and assistance was coming in, but it was coming in just too slowly for many people on the ground. So is there an economic link? Is there an economic pressure point that sort of is coming back to the coup? Is it possible that these things that some of the pro-military protesters and the military have said are enough for the military to come back and try to take over power again?
So firstly, the pro-military protesters were very thin on the ground. There was about, at this supposedly big protest, there were 3,500 citizens in favor of the military. And I think the military has miscalculated big time as to their own popularity in this context of Sudan at this point in time. Big miscalculation. The point you made, which was regarding the military's influence in the economy, yes, completely correct. Very large influence, very large economic interests. And I'm talking about the military in the wider sense. You've also got to consider the RSF, Rapid Support Forces, which fall under quasi-military individual Hemedti. So there is a combination of a very strong, very large economic influence, but essentially, I think they've severely miscalculated, one, the international response, and two, the economic situation in Sudan itself. I think, you've got to look behind the scenes and look at who is supporting this military move. And I think, you have these middle powers like Egypt, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. There's Saudi Arabia, in a conversation with Secretary Blinken, demanded that Sudan return to the situation pertaining before the coup, which the military general is not calling a coup. So I think big miscalculation, yes, very big influence within the Sudanese context. The military does have a very big influence, very big economic influence as well. And I think they were worried that, there was going to be a move towards a purely civilian government. And I think that's what they've tried to preempt. But make no mistake, I think this is a very bad miscalculation on their side.
So let's talk about some of those middle powers that we're seeing, possibly the hand somewhere in the background. We've heard from the U.S., we've heard from the World Bank, we've heard as well from the IMF and the AU. But as you said, Sudan does have some friends in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, which also did provide some crucial financial aid to the general in charge now, General Abdel Fattah Burhan, in 2019. They seem to have been quite quiet. Do you think they're ready to commit some funds? Because the world agrees that Sudan is at this point, again, needing economic assistance. Would they be willing to step in?
Well, not on the scale that, the World Bank, the IMF, the US, the European partners were able to scale in. No, I can't see the UAE, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia making a similar contribution. And therefore, I think, the General Burhan is being shortchanged if he thinks they can. This is far more complicated than, a situation that they can fix easily. And furthermore, I think, you're going to see the street response, and I think the street response will be overwhelming. Sudan needs an enormous amount of money, and it needs also the goodwill of its international partners who've already withdrawn it very quickly. And it needs the goodwill of its citizens. Otherwise, what are you going to be ruling? And I think that's the miscalculation that's been made by General Burhan, that you can repress the citizenry into some kind of submission. And I don't think that's going to be possible.
So let's talk about this aid now. We've seen a lot of money right now being withheld. So Sudan was able to access billions of dollars in grants from the World Bank for the first time in 30 years after it cleared its arrears. The World Bank had also contributed some $3 billion in aid to Sudan to support agriculture, tourism, healthcare, and education as well. But now that aid has been suspended. The U.S. has also frozen some $700 million in aid. What effect is this likely to have on the Sudanese, the people on the ground, the people at the very bottom of this who are being piled on, and they're going to be the ones feeling it the most? So what effect are you anticipating this freezing of aid and assistance is going to have?
So your point is very well made. When aid gets frozen, it always impacts the citizen on the ground much more than anybody else. So I'm afraid that the average Sudanese citizen is caught between a rock and a hard place. The amounts you quoted are very, very substantial, and they're just not going to be replaceable. So I think what you're going to see as outcomes, you're going to see a sharp fall in the Sudanese pound. You're going to see inflation turn around again and head higher, which was something that was directionally was going in the right direction. And you're going to see tremendous pressure on the economy. So, I think it's extraordinary, that the military think that they have a better chance of fixing the economy than the transitional government had. So you're correct there. We're going to see the economy slump, nosedive, and potentially we're going to see cliff edge effects now.
So what would it take to reverse this? Because this is Sudan coming out of almost 30 years of near isolation, both on the economic and on the international relations front. So if we were to say that now the military says we're stepping back, we're going back to the Transitional Council, the goodwill that has been built in the past 2 years has basically been lost. What would it take for Sudan to get back to this point where so many countries and international lenders and creditors are willing to even have the conversations?
Well, I think they've got to return to the situation that was pertaining before this coup d'etat, and they've got to do it very, very quickly. I think, General Burhan has got to understand that he made a terrible mistake, and that if that he's now got to back down. Counterintuitively, it might be a lesson for the military to teach them that this is no longer possible. Sudan has a long history of coup d'etats since its independence. So, if one wants to look at this more positively, one can say, look, he shot his shot and he's discovered it's a blank, and now he's got to back down really fast, and somebody's got to give him a golden ladder so he can back down really quickly. So I think those are the outcomes that we need. Sudan, I think we spoke about it before, full of promise, full of upside, lots of potential. We thought we were emerging from those dark days of Bashir. And I think you're going to find that this coup d'etat, so-called coup d'etat, or they prefer not to call it a coup d'etat, really will not hold for very, very long. And I'm sure a lot of people are putting pressure as we speak on the general to step back from the brink quickly.
All right, Ali, please hold on. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, there's a lot more in this conversation. Questions around whether or not the debt cancellation that has happened could be reversed, and what happens next with the economy. We'll also talk about the Paris Club of Creditors and what they could do in reverse, or rather now because of the coup. The conversation on the economic implications of Sudan's coup continues after this break. My guest is Aly Khan Satchu, and now let's look at what work Sudan has been doing. So Sudan was working to lower its debt. In July, Sudan passed the decision point under the IMF and the World Bank's Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative. Even though that was expected to take 3 years, it was expected that the country's debt would go from $56.5 billion to around $6 billion. That's in jeopardy now. What else do you think is really at stake? What else is in jeopardy with the coup that has happened now?
I mean, just look at those numbers. That's a huge improvement, and makes it manageable. I mean, if you're getting your country back on a high growth trajectory, that debt that you just mentioned post the renegotiation would have been perfectly manageable. Then you had a whole bunch of support coming from France in particular, the United States. You were getting basically soft money, large grants, and large economic support to support the transition. So all of that is going to be at risk. Sudan was being reintegrated into the global economy. This post-sanctions regime was allowing them to sort of plug themselves back into the global economy. That's now at serious risk. So, this is really going from what was such a promising situation of sunny uplands in front of them. Admittedly, it was going to take a little while, back to the very, very dark days of Omar al-Bashir and a kind of hermit kingdom of Sudan.
All right, so do you think there's a possibility that the debt relief that Sudan has worked so hard for could be canceled and the country asked to pay back its debt, or it will hold regardless?
I don't see it holding if the military does not take a step back. I think, that was a quid pro quo of this journey to transiting into a more democratic future. And I think that was very much part of the deal. And I think, this was largely negotiated by Prime Minister Hamdok and his team. And therefore, if you are going to put him under house arrest and disband his entire government, I don't see how those agreements will hold at all. I think those are all in danger of being torn up and Sudan returning to being a pariah state and with all the consequences that come with being a pariah state.
Do you think it can go as far back or as far as seeing the sanctions that came into play in the 1990s being reinstated? These were sanctions that were just lifted about December 2020. Could we see a reinstatement of the sanctions, particularly by the U.S., and maybe having them go back to the state sponsor of terrorism if the military digs their heels in and refuses to go back to a transition to a sovereign council that includes civilian leaders?
So, that sanctions regime came in place because of, Sudan being a state sponsor of terrorism. I don't think anyone's accusing anybody today of such a thing. But I think what you're going to find is that the international community are going to use all the levers at their disposal to put significant pressure on the military to get them to step back from the brink. So I don't see us going to that nuclear option, but I see us going a long way towards it. And this scenario will be very, very difficult to manage. The economy is so weak, the situation on the ground is so tough. And I think the military are miscalculating, because they'll be the ones whom the citizens will point the finger at, as things get worse. So big miscalculation, I think, a big overstepping of the mandate. But however, I think if one analyzes this politically, there is a chance here that, the military finally understand their place in society and return to the barracks for good because of this situation.
So all the negotiations aside that have happened with the Sovereign Council, including the civilian leaders, do you think Sudan's military has what it takes to economically lead the country?
Absolutely not. I don't think they have the capacity to do that. I don't think they have the expertise. They're very mistaken if they believe they have. And therefore, I simply don't see how they're going to do it. They might own some of the commanding heights of the economy, but certainly they don't have the capacity to get this show moving. Hamdok was brought in specifically to deliver on that mandate. He was delivering. I think he was delivering too well, because ultimately it would have meant the return of the military to the barracks. And I think that's what preempted this move.
So, Aly Khan, as we wrap up, what happens next? We've seen Sudan's people suffer through years of economic mismanagement under the Omar al-Bashir regime. We've seen the pain of the reforms that it took for the country to get to this point with creditors and international lenders. But we've also heard some of the numbers. Now, according to the United Nations, the number of people needing humanitarian assistance in Sudan has more than doubled since 2015. They also estimate that in rural Sudan, households spend more than 75% of their income on food. Inflation is at 342% as of March of this year. What happens next? What's the short-term, medium, and long-term implications of this coup for a country that has been striving so hard to revive its economy?
Well, the implications are that all of those points that you made are going to get worse, not better. And therefore, the implications are very, very grave. If it gets worse, it's going to be significantly worse. And that's the unfortunate part of it. All those indicators were already in red territory, and now it's going to be far worse. So I think the implications are very, very grave. I really do. And I think, sensible people all over the world will be speaking to Burhan and saying, look, this can't go on. You've got to step down. And they've got to find a way for him to do that, which maintains his gravitas.
And let me ask this, the regional implications. Sudan is a very key, important country in the east of, in the Horn of Africa, East Africa region. These implications, we know about the refugee camps, we know about the issues surrounding some of the Gulf issues as well. What are the regional implications that countries such as Kenya and Ethiopia, Eritrea need to be concerned about, Somalia as well, as we look at this situation now?
So that's another really important point. I mean, as you know, there's been a flashpoint on the Sudanese border with Ethiopia. Ethiopia's been undergoing a civil war at the moment. That's the best way we can describe it, and it looks fairly intractable. There's been this contested territory between Sudan and Ethiopia. And then, of course, if the economy significantly deteriorates, the potential to export the problem into the region only grows dramatically. So I think regionally, the Horn of Africa looks so fragile. If you look at it from Ethiopia's perspective, from Sudan's perspective, Gutierrez called Sudan a part of an epidemic of coups d'etats. It's very difficult at this point in time to be optimistic about the situation that we're facing across the Horn of Africa. It really is.
All right, Aly Khan Satchu, thank you so much for joining me. We'll be watching this. We're just days into this coup. There could be changes any moment, and definitely we'll be touching base with you as anything comes up.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. And General Abdel Fattah Burhan says Sudan is still moving towards democracy and elections in 2023, but the stakes are very high for the country right now. A country rich in natural gas, gold, silver, zinc, iron, and chromate. In June 2020, it opened up its gold market to generate revenue, and the Sovereign Council sought ways to ensure safer mining and a greater contribution to public finances. The economic pain in Sudan has been harsh for years. The hard work done to move the country from international pariah to rejoining the global economy is now in jeopardy. The next few weeks will likely determine Sudan's economic fortunes for the next few years. You're watching Business Edge. Up next, NC4 to watch. A few stories we're keeping our eyes on kicks off in the eastern parts of the continent, where Kenya's President Uhuru Kenyatta says Africa's gross domestic product could contract by as much as 30% by 2050 if action isn't urgently taken to address climate change. Now, while African countries contribute relatively little to climate change, in terms of carbon emissions, they are among the hardest hit, partly because they rely heavily on rain-fed farming. Rising temperatures and sea levels, as well as rainfall anomalies, have heightened the frequency and intensity of natural disasters. Namibia plans to establish a sovereign wealth fund by the end of the year that will be used as a buffer against further and future economic shocks. The government plans to invest about 2.5% of the intergenerational fund in infrastructure projects. South Africa's MultiChoice Africa Holdings, owner of DSTV and GoTV cable television brands, has lost the battle over the $342 million tax backlog it was asked to pay by the Nigerian government. The Tax Appeal Tribunal has struck out the appeal by the South African company's Nigerian subsidiary, MultiChoice Nigeria Limited, citing the firm's non-compliance with the rules of appeal. And finally, a major leak in the pipeline running to Libya's Es Sadar terminal has led to a shutdown. A statement by the National Oil Corporation said the terminal will require 7 to 10 days of maintenance. The shutdown will cause a reduction of 200,000 barrels per day in Libyan oil shipments. And that's our show for today. Don't forget to follow us on social media at News Central TV. And of course, subscribe to our YouTube channel, download our mobile app, and watch us live on the various platforms we're available on. I'm Tolulope Adeleru-Balogun. I'll see you again soon.